Hey guys! Today we're diving into another truly horrifying case. If you want to support my channel, make sure to subscribe and stay active. It really helps me out. I'd be super grateful for that. Let's get started. A reckless venture is often described as a risky and highly questionable undertaking carried out in the hope of success. This applies not only to financial gain or personal benefit, but also to emotions and relationships. However, such a reckless approach is usually dangerous, leading to heightened psychological and physical tension, with consequences that can be unpredictable. The case of Lizette Cuesta could have been the kind of crime that remained unsolved if everything had gone according to the perpetrator's plan, but they never anticipated that their carefully laid-out scheme would be disrupted. Lizette Maria Cuesta was born on October 21, 1998, in the large metropolitan city of San Jose, located in Western California. She was the eldest of 3 siblings in her family. Her childhood was spent on a spacious family ranch, where she grew up active, outgoing, hardworking, and full of life. She loved sports, rollerblading, and skateboarding. Lizette had a wide circle of friends, adored animals, and was known by those around her as a kind and compassionate person. By the time she reached high school, Lizette had blossomed into a striking young woman. She enjoyed experimenting with her appearance, creating bold and expressive looks that never failed to draw attention. As one of the most popular girls at school, she was even crowned prom queen. When Lizette was in her teenage years, her parents decided to divorce, which was a difficult experience for their children. In 2016, shortly after graduating high school, she expressed her desire to move with her father, Ray, to the city of Tracy in San Joaquin County, California. He had been offered a promising job opportunity there, and Lizette enrolled in a local college. Her younger siblings, who were still minors at the time, remained with their mother on the family ranch. Despite the move, Lizette maintained a warm and close relationship with her mother, brother, and sister, frequently visiting them. Her decision to relocate was primarily driven by her unwillingness to leave her father, who was dealing with health issues, to navigate a new life alone. Additionally, she was eager for a change of pace, trading the fast-moving environment of a city with over 1 million residents for a quieter, more laid-back lifestyle. On top of that, the college in Tracy had offered her a scholarship. Lizette quickly adjusted to her new surroundings, making friends with ease. She was excelling in her college studies, and within 6 months, she found a part-time job at a small local hardware supply company. There, she met and became friends with 25-year-old Melissa Leonardo and 19-year-old Daniel Gross, a couple who were engaged to be married. Before long, Daniel started showing interest in Lizette, and she didn't resist his advances. A relationship sparked between them, and Lizette believed that Daniel would eventually leave his fiancée for her. However, Daniel was content with his current situation and saw no reason to choose between the two women. About a month into the affair, Melissa discovered that she was expecting a child, and the couple began preparing for their wedding. However, even with a baby on the way, Daniel had no intention of ending things with Lizette. When Melissa found out about the situation, she didn't lash out or create a dramatic scene. She feared that if she pushed too hard, Daniel might ultimately choose Lizette over her. Instead, she had a conversation with him, during which he not only admitted to the affair, but also suggested that Lizette move in with them. Naturally, Melissa rejected the idea. But despite this, Daniel continued seeing Lizette openly. Unable to make a decision, Daniel insisted that he cared for both women equally and was afraid of losing either one. Somehow, he managed to convince Melissa to give the unconventional arrangement a try, and Lizette eventually moved in with them. Lizette never told her family the full truth about her relationship situation. Her parents knew that she had moved in with someone named Daniel, but they had no idea that he was engaged to another woman who was expecting a child. On the other hand, Daniel's circumstances were different. He was still living in his mother Gloria's home, making it impossible to keep his personal life a secret from her. When Gloria found out about the unconventional arrangement, she tried to talk some sense into her son. She warned him that relationships like this rarely ended well, but Daniel dismissed her concerns, insisting that he could handle the situation himself and asking her to stay out of his private affairs. From the beginning, Gloria had a strained relationship with Melissa. She disapproved of her son's choice, believing Melissa to be arrogant, self-centered, and manipulative. In contrast, she immediately bonded with Lizette and hoped that Daniel would ultimately choose her instead. This dynamic created a tense atmosphere in the house, but Daniel didn't seem to mind. If anything, he enjoyed the idea of being at the center of attention, almost like a king with two queens. However, it wasn't long before the situation took a dark turn. On February 12, 2018, around 3 a.m., a distressed man called the emergency services in San Joaquin County. He reported that he and his friends had discovered a severely injured young woman on the side of a remote country road. The location was isolated, with the road cutting through rolling hills, and there was no cell service in the area. As a result, the caller had to drive several miles before he could get a signal. That night, the group of friends had been driving back from a nearby town when they decided to take a shortcut along a narrow highway through the hills. Suddenly, their headlights illuminated something on the roadside. At first, they thought it was an animal that had been hit by a car. Curious and wanting to help, they pulled over to check. But as they got closer, they realized that it wasn't an animal at all. It was a young woman, badly wounded and pleading for help. Her chest, arms, and neck were covered in deep gashes, likely inflicted with a sharp object, and her clothes and hair were soaked in blood. The men were shocked, having never seen anything like this before. They knew that moving her could be dangerous, so they decided to call for help immediately. One of the friends stayed with the injured woman, while the other two raced off in search of cell service. The man who remained with her quickly realized that she had a severe wound on her throat, and blood was pouring from it. He gently lifted her head, pressed fabric against the injury to slow the bleeding, and covered her with his jacket in an attempt to keep her warm. As they waited for paramedics to arrive, he kept talking to her, trying to keep her conscious, fearing that if she lost awareness, she might not wake up again. He also noticed marks on her wrists, suggesting that she had been tied up at some point. But what could a young college student have possibly done to provoke such a brutal attack? When the paramedics arrived, the victim was still alive, but they quickly realized that she needed to be transported by an emergency helicopter. Given the severity of her injuries, there was little chance she would survive a regular ambulance ride to the hospital. The air transport arrived promptly, and she was rushed to the nearest medical facility, where one of the state's top surgeons was ready to operate. However, despite their best efforts, doctors were unable to save her. She passed away during surgery, with the cause of death determined to be multiple deep wounds and significant blood loss. The medical examiners later confirmed that the victim had suffered more than 30 stab wounds, with deliberate strikes to the chest, neck, and face. It was clear that she had fought for her life. Her hands showed defensive wounds, and her wrists bore marks indicating she had been restrained. At least 10 of the injuries were fatal on their own, as they caused severe damage to vital organs. Her face had been severely disfigured, which might have made identification difficult. However, there was no need for forensic analysis to determine who she was, because before she passed, she had managed to say not only her name, but also the names of those responsible for the attack. The victim was identified as 19-year-old college student Lizette Cuesta, and the people she accused of the brutal crime were Daniel Gross and Melissa Leonardo. At the time, investigators were unsure of the exact nature of the trio's relationship or what had motivated such a violent act. But while doctors were fighting to save Lizette's life, a crime scene unit was already processing the area where she had been found. They discovered that Lizette had crawled nearly 100 yards along the roadside, refusing to give up and desperately seeking help. Even the most seasoned investigators were stunned by her determination. No one could believe that a person with such extensive injuries had managed to cover such a distance. Following the blood trail, Officers found a rope stained with blood as well as Lizette's purse. Inside were cash and bank cards, ruling out robbery as a motive. From the beginning, the excessive brutality of the attack suggested something deeply personal. Since Lizette had named her attackers before passing, authorities knew they had no time to waste. Her assailants could attempt to flee at any moment. Several patrol units, along with a SWAT team, were immediately dispatched to Gross's home. The arrest played out like something from an action movie. Law enforcement surrounded the house, snipers took positions on nearby rooftops, and officers used a megaphone to order everyone inside to come out with their hands up. The dramatic scene quickly attracted the attention of neighbors, who gathered from all over the area to watch. Some even speculated that a film crew might be shooting a movie. The high-profile arrest later made headlines in local newspapers and was covered in the evening news. 3 people stepped out of the house, a young couple and an older woman, Daniel's mother. All of them looked confused and terrified, clearly unprepared for a police raid backed by a SWAT team. Melissa was still in her pajamas when she was taken in for questioning. The neighbors were stunned by the dramatic arrest and began speculating about what could have led to such an intense police operation. According to them, Daniel and his mother had moved into the house about 3 years prior, and at first, everything seemed normal. Back then, Daniel was still in high school and had made a good impression on those who lived nearby. About a year ago, he brought Melissa into the home, and then, just a few months before the incident, Lizette appeared. Many suspected that the arrest might be connected to illegal substances, as the young couple was rumored to use them occasionally. In recent months, suspicious visitors had been coming and going from the house, leading some to believe that the couple might have been involved in dealing or purchasing illicit substances. However, those theories were nothing compared to the horrifying truth behind their arrest. Gloria was the first to speak during questioning. When the older woman learned that Lizette had been brutally attacked and that her only son was accused of the crime, she immediately tried to shift the blame onto Melissa. According to her, she had never liked Melissa, whom she saw as manipulative and controlling. In her mind, only Melissa could have been behind such a terrible act. Gloria admitted that she had never approved of her son's unusual relationship arrangement, but somehow he had convinced his pregnant fiancée to go along with it. At first, it seemed like everyone was content, but in reality, tensions had been brewing. Melissa didn't want to share her fiancé with anyone, especially with a younger, attractive woman like Lizette. On top of that, she was deeply concerned about what would happen after the baby was born. She feared that Daniel might change his mind about marrying her, or worse, leave her for Lizette. A week before the tragic incident, Gloria overheard a heated conversation where Melissa said that Lizette needed to be taught a lesson. At the time, Gloria hadn't thought much of it. She never imagined those words could mean something so extreme. Even so, she later admitted that she had warned Lizette to be careful around Melissa. However, Lizette had brushed off the concern, saying she already knew what to expect from her. Gloria also confessed that she felt guilty for not going to the police sooner when she sensed something was wrong. She believed that if she had spoken up, the tragedy might have been prevented. Despite her regret, she was adamant that her son was innocent, and that the entire attack had been orchestrated by his pregnant fiancée. When police confronted Daniel with the evidence they had already gathered, they made it clear that denying his involvement would be pointless. They urged him to tell the truth, warning that his only chance of a fair outcome was to cooperate. Backed into a corner, Daniel began giving a statement, but instead of revealing a consistent version of events, he kept contradicting himself. At first, he tried to take all the blame, but his story kept changing, making it clear that there was more to the situation than he was admitting. According to Gross, that evening, he and his fiancée decided to go for a drive with Lizette to unwind. Melissa was behind the wheel, while he and Lizette sat in the back seat, where they allegedly used prohibited substances and drank a beer. As the couple relaxed, things became intimate between them, which was why, according to Gross, they turned onto a deserted road to avoid attracting attention. Daniel claimed that the rope was part of a role-playing scenario, and that Lizette had willingly agreed to be tied up, with no intention to harm or discomfort her. However, after their encounter, he alleged that Lizette suddenly became aggressive and attacked him with a knife, the same one he had previously gifted her for self-defense. He insisted that he was acting in self-defense, grabbing the knife and striking her, but she wouldn't stop. He claimed he continued striking until he suddenly realized he had gone too far. This version of events had major inconsistencies. First, Gross had no cuts or injuries on his hands or body to suggest that Lizette had attacked him at all. Second, if she had been restrained, how could she have grabbed a knife in the first place? When investigators pointed this out, Daniel quickly changed his story. He suddenly remembered that Lizette hadn't attacked him with a knife at all, but had instead started hitting him with her elbows, demanding to be untied. He claimed he tried to comply, but Lizette became enraged, striking him repeatedly. At that moment, he said, he grabbed the knife himself, but was in such a state that he didn't realize what he was doing until it was too late. When asked why he had a knife with him in the first place, he responded that he always carried one. Any inconsistencies in his statements he blamed on being under the influence, saying he couldn't recall the exact sequence of events or his own reasoning. When officers questioned what Melissa had been doing during all of this, Daniel gave a short and simple answer. She was driving. This response made it seem as if Melissa had been completely unaware of what was happening in the back seat, just inches behind her. Melissa, who was pregnant at the time, was reluctant to cooperate with the police, avoiding most of their questions. She claimed that she hadn't used any substances that night and had been completely sober while driving. According to her, she was fully aware that her fiancé was having an intimate encounter with Lizette in the back seat, and she didn't have an issue with it. She also confirmed that the rope was part of a role-playing scenario and that Lizette had willingly allowed herself to be tied up. However, when asked about what happened next, who attacked whom and why Daniel had been so violent, Melissa repeatedly insisted that she didn't know. She claimed she had seen nothing and had no idea what was happening in the back seat. Her explanation was that she had turned up the music so loud that she didn't notice when sounds of pleasure turned into screams of distress. Her description of the following events was vague and inconsistent. She stated that she pulled over only because Daniel told her to, but still didn't understand what was going on. By the time she realized something was wrong, she believed that Lizette was already unresponsive. According to her, Daniel assured her he would handle everything and instructed her to stay in the car. Melissa claimed that Daniel then dragged what he believed to be a lifeless body from the vehicle and left it on the side of the road. Afterward, she admitted, they made a clumsy attempt to get rid of the evidence. As mentioned earlier, before passing away, the victim was able to state her name and identify those responsible for the attack. However, due to severe blood loss and a critical injury to her throat, she couldn't provide any further details. The man who stayed with her on the roadside, applying pressure to her wound until paramedics arrived, later testified in court. He had urged her to keep speaking to stay conscious, and during that time, she revealed that there were 2 attackers. After being left for dead on the deserted road, she managed to regain consciousness and crawled toward the highway, hoping someone would stop and help. That night, 2 cars passed by before help finally arrived. The driver of the first vehicle didn't even slow down and never reported seeing anything unusual. The second driver, an elderly woman, was too afraid to stop on a dark, empty road. However, after reaching town, she called emergency services. Interestingly, her call was placed around the same time as the call made by the man who had found Lizette. Lizette repeated the names of her attackers once more to the paramedics who arrived on the scene and mentioned the 3 cars, 2 that had driven past and the one she had been in before the attack. She repeated the names again while being airlifted to the hospital. Yet, for some reason, no one thought to record her statements or document them on video. This became a significant issue later, as her statements could have been challenged in court or dismissed as unreliable due to her weakened state. Even though the suspects had started giving statements and didn't deny being involved in the attack, law enforcement needed strong evidence for the trial. There was also the possibility that Melissa and Daniel could later retract their confessions. Investigators knew they had to act fast and conducted a search of the home where the three had been living. Inside Daniel's room, officers found prohibited substances, confirming that he had been under the influence that night. In Melissa's bedside drawer, they discovered prescription medication, traces of which were later found in Daniel's system, despite his claims that he had never taken anything like that. In the garage, officers found a rope identical to the one used to bind the victim's wrists. Another section of the same rope was in the trunk of the car the trio had been driving that night. Furthermore, forensic experts analyzed the blood-stained rope found near the roadside, confirming that it carried both Lizette's and Daniel's DNA, proving that he had been the one who restrained her. The car's interior had been cleaned, but not thoroughly enough. Forensic testing easily identified whose blood had been inside the vehicle. Investigators also found the knife used in the attack, which the suspects hadn't managed to dispose of. While the blade itself had been wiped clean of fingerprints, Daniel's prints were found on the plastic bag it had been stored in. The defense team tried to argue that the attack on Lizette had been unplanned and happened in the heat of the moment. However, all the evidence pointed to the opposite. The presence of both the knife and the rope in the car, the chosen remote and isolated location, and the brutal nature of the attack itself. Everything suggested that this wasn't an impulsive act. It was something that had been carefully set up in advance. Daniel and Melissa had planned everything in advance. This crime was supposed to be perfect. They believed that if Lizette disappeared, it would take time before anyone started looking for her. Most of her family lived in another city, and she hadn't been in frequent contact with her father. At work, her colleagues wouldn't raise alarms right away, buying them valuable time. Daniel deliberately struck her in the face and neck, intending to disfigure her beyond recognition and make identification difficult if her body was ever found. The sheer number of injuries indicated that she was never meant to survive. When they left her on the roadside, they assumed she was already gone, but they didn't check to make sure, thinking that even if she was still alive, she wouldn't last until morning due to the cold. The couple didn't immediately try to cover their tracks, believing they had plenty of time before the body would be discovered. However, the early morning police raid caught them completely off guard. Had everything gone according to plan and Lizette not lived long enough to give her statement, they might have escaped justice. One question remained. Why would Daniel commit such an extreme act if he was already getting exactly what he wanted? He had worked hard to create this unusual living arrangement, and he seemed satisfied with it. So why would he suddenly decide to eliminate Lizette? It didn't add up. The answer came from Gloria. She revealed that her son had underlying mental health issues and trouble controlling his temper. However, she insisted that, in general, he wasn't dangerous. But Melissa, desperate to get rid of her romantic rival, had been secretly giving him the very medications found in her nightstand, substances later detected in his system. Under their influence, Daniel became more suggestible, and Melissa repeatedly convinced him that Lizette needed to be dealt with. Eventually, he followed through on her wishes. Daniel refused to take a plea deal, insisting on taking full responsibility and claiming that Melissa had only been driving and had not participated in the attack. Given that she was pregnant at the time of her arrest and authorities were concerned that stress could cause complications, she was placed under house arrest until her trial. Daniel's trial began in the summer of 2018. At the first hearing, he apologized to Lizette's family and pleaded guilty to first-degree murder with aggravating circumstances. However, he continued to refuse to provide details about his actions or a clear motive, claiming that his memory was unreliable due to the influence of prohibited substances. In August 2018, he was convicted of first-degree murder with all associated charges and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. At that time, Melissa was still awaiting trial. She denied any involvement in planning or carrying out the attack and hoped to avoid punishment since Daniel had taken all the blame. However, Lizette's family pushed for her conviction, insisting that she had played a major role. The legal process dragged on for years. It wasn't until 2023 that Melissa, now 30 years old, was finally found guilty on all counts. Although she had never held the knife, she had conspired, planned, and facilitated the attack, as well as helped dispose of evidence. She was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Remarkably, Daniel's case was also reviewed in 2023. At 24 years old, his life sentence was reduced to 16 years behind bars. Lizette's family was outraged by what they saw as lenient sentencing and vowed to appeal the decision. Thanks for watching, everyone. Your support means a lot to me, and you can help my channel grow by hitting that like button, dropping a comment, and sharing this video. Your engagement really makes a difference. See you soon.